All right, greetings and welcome back to Sex, Race, and Class. Um, Today we are going to talk about class matters. Mobility is the promise that lies at the heart of the American dream. When we think about the American dream, we think about what is it that the United States as a country promises not only its citizens, but anyone who comes to these waters, anyone who contributes to the economy, to the way of life that exists for US citizens, what is the thing that is often promised? And that is from the beginning of its existence as a European colony, and then as a evolution or an independent nation from that European colony. It's always been marketed as this place of opportunity, as a place of growth, as a place that if you can come with $1 in a dream, you can achieve success, right? That is the idea. The idea is that the United States is this democratic experiment that suggests that if you do right and if you work hard enough, you'll be able to achieve the what? The American dream. And part of that American dream is social mobility. Social mobility means you move from one class status to another. You move from being poor to working class to middle class to upper middle class to upper class to wealthy. You can achieve that with hard work, determination, and ingenuity, right? Um, so let's talk a little bit about social class. This is based off of your reading Class Matters. And the question that we ask in this is, what is social class? Well, social class is one of those social identities that is difficult, extremely difficult to really break down and define, right? Um, when we look at sociology, you can generally find a pretty acceptable definition of race, right? You can find an acceptable definition of gender, right? You can find an acceptable definition of sexuality. But when we talk about describing and understanding class, it gets extremely nuanced. It's difficult to break down the categories of social class. It can change. And we're going to talk about that in a second as well. But social class can be very nuanced. It can be subjectively identified, which means regardless of what society says I am in terms of a social class, my social class is really what matters. And it's very different from how race can be subjectively identified or gender can be subjectively identified. Class is subjectively identified in a different way. To other people, you can look middle class, right? Based on your education, based on your occupation, based on your income, and your income as it relates to your family structure. Um, you could absolutely look middle class, but you can feel working class because only you know your debt to income ratio. Only you know your credit score. Only you know how much money is getting put aside for retirement. Only you know who all you have to take care of in your family. And that could be culturally based. Um, Only you know your spending habits. So class can look one way to other people, but look another way to you, right? You can look middle class based on what you do, where you work, and occupation, all of these things. But to you, you also may know that you have a large amount of money in the bank. You may have a large amount of resources and assets that no one knows about that also generate income. You could very well be upper middle class, but you may look lower middle class. And not just by the way you look or dress, but I'm talking about by the ways in which we identify class, right? Through education, income, and occupation. Well, education, income, education, um, Yes, income, education, and occupation, right? Um, that is generally how we understand social class, right? Um, so you have these various ways in which they can be identified. And so we have these subjective ways, but at the same time, we also have these objective ways in which we understand class. All right, because class is not just about how you feel, there are also these additional measures. How much money you make in comparison to how many people that you take care of in your immediate family, that does play a role whether you have a college degree or not. And even if you're not making much money off of that degree, the fact that you have those connections, it means something. It does mean class. When we talked about that, when we talked about networks, community, the people that you know, the type of knowledge that you have, a certain amount of knowledge, regardless of how much money you have in the bank, a certain amount of knowledge gives you a certain class status, right? Occupation. What type of job do you have? You can have a very high paying job, high level job, or you can have a job that doesn't have a great reputation, but it pays a lot of money, right? You can be a plumber that makes $200,000 a year. You can be a professor that makes $80,000 a year, right? But which one has a certain status, right? You also have to look at over time. What is the likelihood of a person being able to keep a certain job or being able to get that job somewhere else? So you have to have so these kind of conversations are extremely important and being able to leverage that in terms of more money later, right? So these objective measures of class is extremely important when we talk about what is social class. But then you also have relational. What are your differential life chances, right? Oh, another way in which we measure social class is also housing. Do you own a home? But that could depend on where you live. If you live in the South or in the Midwest, that is a status symbol, owning a home. If you live in New York or New Jersey or in the middle of Washington, D.C., or in the middle of a large metropolitan urban area, owning a home may not be that important because homes are extremely expensive. If you live in Los Angeles, you could very much be upper middle class and not own a home. You can be upper middle class in New York and not own a car. But if you lived in Kentucky and you consider yourself upper middle class, you absolutely have a car or a driver, maybe, but there's a car that helps you get around. So you have these objective means of measuring social class as well. Then you also got to look at life chances. We've talked about that already, where you have what is the chance of you being able to get a certain level of education? What is the chance of you being able to um, get the type of healthcare that you need? If you have the type of job that gives you the type of insurance where you can get a certain type of healthcare, there you go. That's middle class. If you have the type of job that gives you the type of income where you can put your child in a private school or give them a certain level of specific education, that's it, that there's a class status there. If you have the connections to where if your child needs a internship, an interview, you know certain people who can do certain things, there you go. And so it's an amazing thing when you can see these kinds of class things happen in people's favor. But differential life chances definitely dictate social class. At the end of the day, money matters, class matters. And who you know and the type of money you have and resources you have available determine these things. There are macro variations across time and place. So class matters throughout historical contexts. Depending on when you live and where you live, class may matter more or less. If you lived during the Great Depression, class mattered. But maybe not as much, actually, now that we think about it, because everybody was poor. It was a rough time for everybody, even the rich. If you lived during another time, social class mattered a little more during the 1960s, where things were becoming, where ideas around race and class and gender were at the forefront of the American consciousness. It mattered, I guess, a little less. But then in the 1970s and 80s, when the class disparities were much more pronounced, mattered a little more. So it changes across time and place, depending on who's in office, depending on the political climate, depending on the policies, depending on the health wealth of the nation. Right now, the health wealth of the nation is really, really bad in terms of debt, in terms of how people feel. But in the late 90s, 98, 99, 2000, it was great. Many people had jobs. Many people were middle class and above. So sometimes it just depends on where you are. And then you have this kind of normative understanding where the foundation of economic oppression and exploitation is how we understand social class. Social class sits at, many people would argue, and I personally would argue, to me, that is the foundation for any type of inequality. Before we understood social lines around race, before there was even a thing called race is only about 500, 600 years old. Even before we understood gender inequality is pretty, it's not as new as race. We've been having gender inequality for much longer than racial inequality. But even before gender, even before the gender differences are as pronounced as they are, we've always had rich and poor, whether you had food or you didn't have food. Even if you go back to caveman times or times of the antediluvians in certain places, right? If you can hunt or kill a bear or lion and eat it, and you had that in your home domicile, you had something. And if you didn't, somebody was trying to come and get it from you. That's haves and have-nots. That's the basics of society. What I can have, and those who don't have try to get it from me, and I have to try to protect it. That's basic survival skills, right? And so social class sits at the basis of that. And much of gendered inequality exists because oftentimes women, because they were women, did not have access to the means to then be able to improve their social mobility on their own without having to be connected to a man or a husband. But what is the foundation of that? Having the means to be able to improve their class. Same thing with racial inequality. Racial inequality at the very helm of slavery and colonization, the whole point of it was to build an underclass that could then be a labor force for an entire nation. That was the point of it. Point had nothing to do with race. Race came out of capitalism. Racism was birthed out of capitalism. So the normative understanding of social class is that it is the foundation of economic oppression and exploitation across the board. Because most people who fight against other forms of isms, other forms of oppression, are doing it for the sake of being able to then satisfy themselves and their families and their communities at an economic level. The next slide, we get down to some of the phrases, right? The movement of individuals or groups within a stratification structure. That is what we call social mobility, right? That is what we call social mobility. How you can go, we just talked about that, from one class status to another, from one economic status to another. If we look at the reading, Class Matters, and if we look at the bottom of page 3 and page 4, you see it says, even as mobility seems to have stagnated, the ranks of the elite are opening. Today, anyone may have a shot at becoming a U.S. Supreme Court justice or a CEO, and there are more and more self-made billionaires. Only 37 members of last year's Forbes 400, a list of the richest Americans, inherited their wealth, down from almost 200 in the mid-1980s. And so we see that although mobility has stagnated in terms of people being able to move up, the ranks of being in the elite are opening. There are opportunities where people who did not come from wealth are now able to achieve and have large levels of wealth. So there are people who are on the Forbes 400 that didn't come from extremely well-to-do circumstances, right? But if we look at the paragraph after the next one, it says, but a paradox lies at the heart of this new American meritocracy. Merit has replaced the old system of inherited privilege in which parents, to the manner born handed down the manner to their children. But merit, it turns out, is at least partly class-based. Parents with money, education, and connections cultivate in their children the habits that the meritocracy rewards. When their children then succeed, their success is seen as earned. And so that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the habitus. It goes back to what we were talking about when we were talking about those social influences and those cultural influences that play a key role in class mobility, right? It goes back to what we discussed when we were talking about Bordeaux. And so this leads to that. There is this type of meritocracy that likes to be pushed when it comes to social class. But in fact, there are these inherited privileges that happen, and they're not biologically inherited, but they're socially inherited. So people with money and education can pass on these things that are seen as meritocracy, when in actuality, there's a certain level of class privilege that allows for the next generation to be successful, whether we want to admit it or not. So that leads then to intragenerational mobility, where there can be mobility or movement within a career of one individual. You yourself can go from one class status to another, wherein intergenerational mobility means that one family group can be of one class, and then they put in the work, they put in the sacrifice, and the next family group can be of a certain class, and then they put in the work, and they put in the sacrifice, and then the next generation can do the same. So it's intergenerational as opposed to intragenerational. Now, horizontal mobility is a change from one occupation to another at the same general status level. So you can go from, if you go from being a teacher to being, to working for the city at a manager level, certain jobs where it's pretty much the same kind of status. You're not really growing in terms of money, or you're not really growing in terms of influence or reputation, but it's a very similar base. Vertical mobility, however, is moving upward or downward on the occupational level, on the social class level, right? That's what we call vertical mobility. And so all of these things play a key role in how we understand socioeconomic status, but they also play a key role in how we understand socioeconomic mobility, right? Socioeconomic mobility. These things are very important. And when we understand mobility, we understand that there are these larger structures that keep these things in play. For example, right? There's a difference between a Bill Clinton, a Bill Gates, a Jay-Z, and a Donald Trump. Bill Clinton came from a modest middle class, maybe lower middle class family, but through education, he got the opportunity through a white and male privilege. He got the opportunity to go to an elite school that gave him an elite school that typically reinforces elite people and elite people in politics and connections and networks. And he was able to get in there, make a name for himself, and then use that to then move himself into a very upper middle class and elite space in politics. Bill Gates came from a very well-to-do family, but he was able to take his well-to-do family and build on top of that and create a wealth that few people in the world have seen up close, right? So that is a certain level of socioeconomic mobility that comes with privilege, right? But then you have Jay-Z. Jay-Z he was a rapper that came from very humble beginnings. much more humble than Bill Clinton and Bill Gates. And he was able to leverage his skills as a musician. He was able to leverage his skills as a businessman and as an entrepreneur and use that to his advantage and create and make himself a billionaire, right? Use his forms of entertainment to make himself a billionaire. Donald Trump started out probably better than anybody on this list. And then he was able to then network, use his skills, his charisma, whether we want to believe it or not. There is a certain level of charisma that he has to be able to get the votes and the support that he has been able to acquire and use that to then become president. Not once, but twice, right? So this is what we call mobility, being able to go from one area and then go to another. But we also have these newer studies of mobility as well. If we look on page 11, if you scroll down to page 11, it says the new studies of mobility, which methodically track people's earnings over decades, have found far less movement. The economic advantage, once believed to last only 2 or 3 generations, is now believed to last closer to 5. Mobility happens, just not as rapidly as was once thought. So now that we're tracking mobility over time, we're seeing that there is less movement. That whatever advantage one has, it lasts now longer. So going from one class to another can still happen. It just is now taking a lot longer for the average person, not for these, you know, special situations, right? And not to say these people didn't work hard, because they did. Some harder than others, but they did, right? There's a certain level of hard work. But for your average person that doesn't fall in these kind of outliers, if you will, that mobility is not happening in that way. And the reason why is because the economic and social structure of the United States is not set up for people to be able to do that. Because in order for those people to stay elite, a lot of people have to remain at the bottom. A lot of people have to continue to remain workers and in need of support from a very unequal system. So these new studies of mobility is helping us understand that. And then going back to what we were talking about the capital, the cultural capital, the social capital, this is what we mean when we're talking about this, how people are able to move up and down, even without the economic support, right? Or the economic corroboration from a family member or friends, having that cultural capital, having that social capital to be able to network and make the moves necessary to be successful, right? If we go to the next slide, women work 200 more hours than they did in the mid-70s, while men work about 100 hours more than was done in previous times in the mid-70s. Right? This is what we found in a lot of the social class research. It's not that people aren't working hard. People are actually working harder and working more. But the structure, and we saw that in the video, in a previous video that we looked at, that you were supposed to look at, where you can see that over time, CEOs started to pocket much, much, much more money, especially when deindustrialization occurred in the 1970s and 80s. You take away those low-skilled jobs, you take away those working-class jobs, those blue-collar jobs, those factory jobs, and now we have a structure that there are just as many jobs, but they pay less in America. But the CEOs get to profit more because they outsource those jobs. US have typically low savings rates. And even at the height of the country's economic boom, citizens were in the negative in personal savings rates. So some people argue that people just aren't saving money. Americans just love to spend money, spend money. They're not saving, and that's why they're in the place that they're in. And so people say US citizens spend more than they save, and this was the same issue that led to the stock market crash in 1929. However, we don't look at unexpected bills that occur. It's not that people don't want to save or aren't saving money. It's that people aren't getting paid enough to save and then be able to bounce back when they get unexpected bills, when things happen that they didn't foresee. So saving is important. It is an individual concern, and it is an individual responsibility to have good money managing skills. But it does not absolve the larger structure of being able to create the type of economic system that hardworking US citizens can benefit from. Class and space, this is something that, particularly this notion of the Aspen effect, is very important. And if you read Jenny Stuber's additional work, she talks about this, particularly about social class within Colorado, right? And the levels of social class and how it influences people and generations as well in this setting of Colorado. And so this Aspen effect is very important. The Aspen effect says that the relationship between earning inequality and commute time, how transportation can affect social class. The wealthy live in the center with all of the businesses, and the middle class travel in for work and services. And this is very common in Aspen, Colorado. And so if we go to that second point, it says traveling lessens the option of debt. Having a car allows middle class people to travel to more expensive centers. So actually, when you live in the center where everything is, and you don't have to spend so much money on cars and repairs and insurance and all these different things, and you can walk and go all the places you need to go. So there is a connection between where you live, commute time, and class space. The closer you live to the happenings, which tend to be expensive, but it can affect class and how you get to keep that social class status. The more inequality kind of went backwards, but the more inequality in an area, the more expensive the desirable locations. So then more middle income families feel the need to move further away from the center. So in some areas, particularly in the South and in the Midwest, some middle income families move away from the center. But now we're living in a time where now middle income families are wanting to move closer to the center because of this Aspen effect. Because there was a time in the 50s and 60s and 70s where people wanted, the people who had the money wanted to live on the outskirts. They wanted the land, they wanted the yard, they wanted their kids to be able to run and play and have fun. And the poor people lived in the center. Poor people lived in the city. That's why we always study race with urban studies, because it's this kind of understanding of class, if you will, right? And then urban becomes synonymous with race, urban culture, when most Black people live in the country. They don't necessarily live in the city. So that's a whole nother topic. But the notion of class and space is very important. And seeing that relationship, whether you're talking about people of color or whether you're talking about white people, you see that this affects both any group, regardless of race, right? So this Aspen effect is very important because you see this relationship between class and where people live. But then it also adds on this health component as well, if we look on the next slide. Longer commutes means that US residents are sleeping less. So if you have a long commute from your home to your job, this leads to a weaker immune system, increasing car accidents, deaths due to sleeping at the wheel, etc. So again, there's another aspect. If you don't have the money to live closer to the business districts, you have to live further, which means you have to get up earlier in order to get to work. If you get up earlier, that now affects your health. Now you're not getting as much sleep. Now you have a weaker immune system. We know this when it comes to children. Children who have to take two buses and two trains just to get to school. Now they have to take two buses, two trains to get to school. Now by the time they get to school, instead of getting to school for 7 o'clock and getting up at 6, they may have to get up at 4:30 or 5. And so by the time they get to school, they're sleepy. It's difficult for them to stay awake. It's difficult for them to stay alert. Or by 1 o'clock, they're dog tired. Why? Because they have to wake up at 4:30 or 5 as opposed to maybe 6 or 7 to get to school for 7:30 or 8. So these things are very important, right? All of these social identities and social factors play a role in people's life outcomes. Less money goes to public budget for teachers, road construction, and care for the water supply. Closing of drug treatment and prevention centers due to the suffering middle class and the rising inequality exists because of these relationships between class, space, and health. So all of these things play a role in mobility. The better your class, the better opportunities you have, the closer you can live to where you need to work. The more you do that, the healthier you are, the better you can work, the more positive outcomes you can have, increases your chances of promotion. Better your chances of promotion, the more money you can make, the more you can continue to do these things, and then you can pass those opportunities to your kids. It's complicated, but it's not, right? So if we go to the last slide, we see this U.S. social class ladder. We've talked about different class ladders. And the reason why it is nuanced is because it depends on the research, depends on what they're studying. Some people say there's only two classes, rich and poor. Some people say there's six, two on the bottom, two in the middle, two in the upper. Some people may say it's 10, 13. And there are all these nuanced categories even within each class. So this is why it's very difficult to actually kind of define and identify, but we do our best for the sake of this conversation. And so you see here, according to the American class structure, we see that underclass means some high school, unemployed or maybe part-time work, making about at one point, right? This is older, so adjusting for inflation, but about 10,000 a year. Working poor, some high school, laborers, service workers making about 18,000. These numbers for the income definitely has changed, but the percentage actually hasn't changed much. The percentage of the population of that are underclass, that are working poor, that are working class, middle class, hasn't changed much. The lower middle have some high school, maybe some college, semi-professionals, lower managers, craftspeople, foremen, about $40,000 a year. Think of your teachers. Generally lower middle. Upper middle would be college or university. So you went to school, you graduated, you got a master's degree, you have some type of professional degree, you have an upper management position. That could maybe put you at about $90,000 during that time. Upper middle may be six figures now, above, right? Very low percentage of the population to have that. And then you have your capitalists, and then I would say there's absolutely some stages in between that, but that 1%, and I would even say that 1% is bigger than just investors or top executives. That 1% is probably people who have wealth passed down, not probably, are people who have wealth passed down from generations and generations and generations. But before then, you do have this upper class of people that are worth 7, 8, 9 figures, right? Who are investors, who are top executives, etc. So this is kind of your social class ladder, and this shows how class matters within our society. Shows how class matters within our infrastructure and what that means. Right. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope you learned from the reading and you followed along with the PowerPoint. And again, make sure that you read the module and any information connected to it. Um, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via message, via email, or anything, and I'll get back with you. Hope you have a great day, great week, and a great weekend. See you soon.